It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Henry Kautz. In his career, Professor Kautz has combined research and leadership positions in industry with work at leading academic institutions, including the University of Rochester, where he is now chair of computer science. He's also current president of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence, the leading professional society in that field. A sidelight, he holds a degree in creative writing as well as degrees in computer science, and he's bridged these fields by writing limericks about artificial intelligence research. And if you're interested, you can find these on his website. They're really good as limericks, but they also make really interesting comments about artificial intelligence research. So I hope that'll be a teaser for many of you. As we will hear, much of Professor Kautz's recent work aims at creating advanced computer systems that will enhance the quality of life of people with cognitive disabilities. So please welcome Henry Kautz.
Thank you. Thank you. So in today's talk, I'll be focusing particularly on a kind of assistive technology that I like to call assisted cognition systems. So the vision of assisted cognition systems being pursued by not only my group, but many of the researchers who are associated with this RARC, are computer systems that improve the independence and well-being of people with cognitive disabilities by understanding their behavior from sensor data, using this understanding to actively prompt, warn, and advise, or alert caregivers as necessary. The foundation of this growing area of research comes from work in pervasive sensing. For example, using sensors that can detect movement, location, object manipulation, or physiology. Each year these sensors get cheaper and easier to deploy. They may be worn on the user. They may be a common consumer device like a cell phone, or they may be embedded in the environment. A second leg is work in artificial intelligence or machine learning. How do we model everyday life? How do we design systems that adapt to an individual's behavior and goals? And of course, the final important part is human-computer interaction, because we need to design systems that keep the focus on the user and that, of course, are easy to use. So today I'll talk about two projects that I've been involved with, one on designing an adaptive wayfinding system for cognitively impaired users. The second is more recent work on creating a context-aware task prompting system. And finally, if I have time, I'd like to conclude with a few comments on general challenges for research on assisted cognition systems, or in general, technology for cognitive disability. So let me begin with the first project. This is a collaboration recently concluded between University of Washington Computer Science, and the name Alan Liu is highlighted because this is his PhD thesis work. Professor Gaetano Borriello, well known in pervasive computing circles. Myself, I was at University of Washington when this project began. And people in University of Washington Rehabilitation Medicine, the group headed by Kurt Johnson. So as many or most of us here know, there are many wayfinding difficulties that face people with cognitive disabilities. So for example, we might have a subject, Alice, who doesn't go to new places by herself because even with practice, she has trouble remembering directions. You might have another client who gets lost easily and is unable to use a map effectively to orient himself and to figure out where to go. Or we might have a client, Carol, who takes a regular route between home and work, but one day a road along that route is closed. Okay? So either perhaps she's driving, but perhaps she's on foot or taking public transportation, and they go in a different direction. And she doesn't know how to adapt in a timely fashion. Commercial GPS systems have been a great boon, particularly for those of us who have some mild cognitive impairment. However, why aren't they the complete solution? Well, they generally provide one-size-fits-all route planning. You're going to find the route that minimizes the time or distance when driving. Some of them say they'll minimize distance and time when walking, but often the walking routes they find are really just along highways. They have a one-size-fits-all presentation of directions, a map, and turn-by-turn directions. The directions may be spoken aloud, but still it's essentially go straight, turn left, turn right. Perhaps you'll have the street names. One thing we wanted to understand is what makes a route safe and easy to follow by a cognitively impaired user. Now, as we all know in this field, there's a central research challenge that comes up in essentially every project. Individuals with cognitive impairments can have vastly different abilities and disabilities. So the well-worn phrase, we're designing for a universe of one. However, as researchers, our challenge is to what extent can we uncover common features that lie behind many different successful solutions? And then how can we incorporate these features into a general system that adapts to the user? So here's the research path that this particular project went along. It began with some formative usability studies where we studied direction following capabilities and priorities with potential users using prototypes out in the real world. Now these prototypes, of course, because we had not yet built the fully automated next generation wayfinding systems, they were Wizard of Oz type systems. They had a nice interface. They were being controlled remotely by a human. These formative usability studies suggested that landmark-based directions were particularly good for many users. So I'll describe some work on incorporating landmarks into wayfinding and how we tried to balance cognitive effort with encouraging the user to maintain attention to the environment. And finally, I'll describe some work on modeling individual variation and a general framework, again, described at a very high level, for generating customized and adaptable directions. So as I mentioned, in our formative studies, we had studies both indoors and outdoors for wayfinding using various generations of a Wizard of Oz system. So client would have a device that'd be interacting with a PDA or cell phone. There'd be a researcher watching them, made sure that they were safe, collecting data about their movement. There'd be another researcher who would be driving the wayfinding system. Okay. Well, as you expected, we found a wide variation in user preferences and expectations and directions. Some really preferred images. Relative minority preferred audio. Text was acceptable, again, for many users if it was large enough. Some users could handle more complex directions than others, and there was differences in preferences of timing. How long how many seconds, for example, before an intersection or a crosswalk should you give the prompt to be looking out for that crosswalk. However, it was clear, one of the general things we discovered is that the attention demand for turn-by-turn directions, particularly for this kind of navigation on foot, was problematic. People are looking at the device, they're not paying attention to their environment, they're getting confused. We also experimented in these formative studies with landmark-based directions. So we'd put up a photograph of an object and say, move towards this object. And those seem to be much more successful, again, not for all uses, but for most. So we decided to look more at landmark-based directions. So that in the second phase of the work, again, we developed our next prototype system that would be able to provide prompts, either traditional turn-by-turn prompts or landmark-based directions, with the goals of encouraging attention to the world. They would seem to naturally orient the user in space towards that object. And there was some evidence from literature and psychology and a sociology that people tend to think in terms of landmark-based directions. Well, we wanted to know, though, what are features of good landmarks? These features would be things like how visually distinctive they are, how close they are. Are you going to be moving directly towards the landmark? Are you going to be, let's say, following a path, keeping a landmark at some angle to you? Perhaps you could have a direction move between these two landmarks. So there's lots of different variations. And a landmark could be anything from a traffic light, a stop sign, a building, a piece of sculpture, and so on. So again, we did some studies with participants who had a variety of causes, but who all had great difficulty in wayfinding on foot. So we had patients with TBI, stroke, multiple sclerosis, and developmental disability. So how are we going to present these landmarks? Our earlier work suggested that photographs were good. Now, is that really realistic to imagine we can get photographs at such density, for example, of a city, to be able to provide individual photographs of landmarks? Well, it would have seemed crazy a few years ago, but of course, now we know many research groups are doing just that, and companies like Google and Yahoo are doing that as well. And people discovered ways to integrate photo sharing websites. So we're leveraging collections of geotagged photos. This work was done in the Seattle and the University of Washington campus, where there's a particularly rich set of photographs. We found that a particularly good heuristic is that the most popular photos tended to be the most useful ones. However, even then, the photographs still might be hard to match up to the user's position. So there was also work on saying, how can we augment or modify these photos to make them more closely match the user's perspective? So on the bottom are just some different ways you might use a photograph to present a landmark, ranging from a satellite image, very much just like an ordinary map, to just a regular photograph taken from the collection on which we've overlaid a directional arrow. And the third, we've tried to make it less confusing by warping the image so that arrow is more straight ahead in front of the user. And in the fourth, the one that was generally easiest to match up with the environment, some work done together with people who work in computer graphics, where we used a lightweight 3D model of the buildings on campus and then mapped the images onto these lightweight models, so you could get quite a realistic perspective image of what that landmark should look like from the current location of the user. So what are some of the results from these studies? The particular one, we had 180 total directions given. We noticed there were about 150 followed correctly. There was much variation between the participants in their success at following these different landmark-based directions. The landmarks directions that are most generally successful were those that were in perspective, as we hoped and expected, that were landmarks that were not too terribly distant. So a building, that was 50 yards away was much better landmark than one that you could see but was a quarter mile across town. And when your movement was simply aligned with the path, so moving towards the landmark as opposed to moving like along the side of a landmark. Another general finding is that making turns in relation to a landmark seem to require more cognitive effort. So if a statement like "go left at this building," that actually seemed to have a slightly higher error rate than simply saying a traditional thing, "now turn left," delivered right at the time when you reach the intersection, which suggests that perhaps turn-based directions really should be user-centric, referring always to the user's left and right, as opposed to talking about the left and right sides of buildings, non-user centric. So these studies showed how to create a wayfinding system that was usually better for most users, but it was still far from optimal for many users. So we then wanted to go on to say, can we design a system that does a better job of adapting to the individual user? So the viewpoint we took was looking at adaptation as a kind of optimization problem. So putting on our hats as researchers in machine learning, we said, well, for each user, we want to learn a function that will go from the features of a particular direction, like move towards this particular landmark, and features of the location, so features of the map. For example, are you on a path? Are you in an open space? If you're nearing an intersection, how many different paths intersect at that intersection? Learning a function from that to the probability that that particular user will be successful in following that direction, okay? If we could learn that function, then generating directions would correspond to finding an optimal solution to a sequential decision problem, what technically would be called a Markov decision process. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We could say, well, we look at our data. We've been running these studies. So for the users, we know where they've followed the directions correctly, where they followed them incorrectly. We look at the different features when they were doing things right, when they're doing things wrong. We count up the numbers, we get the probabilities. One problem, however, was we could never have enough user-specific training data. We adopted a solution that we discovered actually in some other work that was used in in work on user modeling for smart homes from Stephen and Tilley's group, was to say, well, use the data from all the users, but weigh that particular user's data more heavily. Okay, so you're going to be learning something from everybody, but use the history of the particular user, weight that more heavily. So we had a small adaptation study. We had 5 participants who had coming back from our earlier studies. And we compared their performance on following routes that were generated using just a generic model, that is, the best possible decision theoretic route we could come up with, where we just combined all of the data from all of the users equally to a personalized model that weighed their particular past experience more heavily. Now, I wish I could say that, gee, we knocked it out of the ball out of the park and we proved 100% this works. We ended up essentially with a qualitative result. Personalized routes considered easier. I'm afraid, as I mentioned, one of the challenges of this kind of work is, again, we need larger, longer studies to quantify the significance, and we hope that that will happen in the future, near future. So, but in summary, I think some of the merits of these study was, well, first, to study wayfinding with real potential users, looking at the range of abilities and preferences and informing the technological requirements. I think we came up with some very interesting ways of using landmarks and presenting landmarks effectively. And at least we have a proof of concept of automatic adaptation that, I said, that overcame some of these data scarcity issues. Okay, so that is the first piece of work I wanted to talk about. And now I'd like to move on to some work that is very much in progress. So this is work that largely is not yet published. We're basically too busy, implementing things to write any papers. So we're working on creating a context-aware daily schedule and daily task prompting systems. And some of the partners in this group are attention control systems, and many of you are familiar with the PEAT system. It was one of the pioneering daily planners for people with cognitive disabilities, and the company run by Rich Levinson. My own group, University of Rochester. We're also working with researchers at the VA Palo Alto, in particular Dr. Harriet Zeiner. And finally, I won't although I won't be talking about her contribution to this project, Professor at UC Santa Cruz, Beth Ann Hockey, who works on speech interfaces. But again, I won't be talking about speech aspects. I'm going to introduce this with a recent news clip that talks first about the PEAT system in general, so the original system from attention control system, and then starts to hint about some of the work we're doing right now. Then I'll go into more detail about that.
Some medical news now. A new device is helping thousands of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan cope with an invisible wound of war. While surgeons have repaired their bodies, the struggle now is to treat their minds.
I can't remember the blast and everything like that.
We first met Jason Poole while he was being treated for severe injuries from a roadside bomb in Iraq. And while doctors at the Palo Alto VA have repaired much of the damage to his head and body, his brain is a much more difficult challenge.
I have like the worst memory, and it's just, it's crappy.
Jason is working on his memory and cognitive skills with therapist Harriet Kautz. But even before he arrives at her office, he has another advisor to help him keep that appointment.
If Dr. Z is ready, turn on the recording. If she's late, press wait.
This is PEAT, short for Planning and Execution Assistant Trainer. The system is built into a smartphone, and it's helping veterans and other traumatic brain injury patients function from day to day.
But it plays, it's just like, well, you have to go to Dr. Zainer's right now, and then I'm like, oh yeah.
The software technology was created at NASA Ames Research Center to help crews running the Mars rover make quicker decisions. Then engineer Rich Levinson had an idea.
When I realized that it's also applicable to people with brain injury and other cognitive impairments.
They started with a specialized day planner, which adjusts to unexpected changes. In this case, an appointment that runs late at the bank.
Please sign your check and also add the account number. Are you done at the bank?
Beside keeping track of names, faces, and appointments, new versions of the device will also monitor a patient's movements and behavior. Rich's team is getting ready to install sensors in Jason's apartment, which will relay information via wireless signals to the phone.
Refrigerator is open. Refrigerator is closed.
And we can tell, for example, what room they're in, whether they're eating breakfast an hour earlier than they were scheduled, and make the adjustments on the fly.
The ultimate goal is to add biosensors, which will alert therapists of spikes in blood pressure or other signs a patient is becoming overwhelmed. Jason's therapist says it's part of an evolving strategy at the VA to help veterans suffering from head trauma.
I think what the VA is learning to do is what do you have to do in the real world to help the individual function in the family.
Jason believes the extra help is already making a difference.
Makes me the brain injury into a normal person.
Now, the team hopes to have those new sensors installed in Jason's apartment as early as next month. We will keep you updated on their progress.
Okay, so just to summarize, so PEAT is this handheld-based scheduling and queuing system for persons with executive function impairment. It's been out for quite a number of years, over 10 years, from attention control systems, with prompts to start and end tasks, and it provides some automatic assistance for task rescheduling by reasoning about deadlines, durations, and priorities between tasks. However, a disadvantage of the current PEAT system, as well as essentially and generally most other prompting systems, is they require some input from the user whenever a task begins or ends. Now, the cost of this use may discourage users to continue using the device. Furthermore, the prompts then can become out of sync. So if the user self-initiates a task before the prompt comes, okay, the prompt will still come. The user maybe has already completed the task and it's prompting them now to do it again, okay? So self-initiation is actually punished. The system then encourages dependency. And finally, the current system doesn't support contingent prompts. So for example, reminding the user to take her walker when she goes outside, okay, not just constantly reminding her to do it under any circumstances. Or if we have a walk scheduled at a particular time. So our goal then is to integrate sensing and prompting, using this information from sensors to improve prompting. And again, I don't claim that this is an original goal. I know many of you in the audience are working on exactly this, this same issue. So what do we do? In terms of sensors, we determine the user's current activity from home automation, motion sensors, and GPS, together with information about the objects the user is handling. So in prior years, I believe, you've heard presentations about the work coming out of Intel Research Seattle, where we have a RFID reader in the form of a bracelet, and that's the current model right there. We can easily put, in an afternoon, hundreds of RFID tags on both fixed and movable objects in a user's home. The bracelet notices whenever the user is moving an object, and that data is transmitted then to the system to help determine the activity. The final piece of information used to tell what the person is doing is the schedule of expected activities, right? So activities that are scheduled are more likely to be recognized than activities that are not scheduled. So given this kind of fairly low level but extremely accurate sensor information, where you are you moving or not, where you are in the house, what objects are you touching. Again, previous work by a number of researchers at Intel, MIT, University of Washington, and other places have shown that fairly simple kinds of probabilistic reasoning systems can determine can distinguish between a dozen or more activities with accuracy in the high 90%. So our goal then is a context-aware version of PEAT. We have not yet come up with a great acronym for that. The R&D is funded by grants from DARPA, the Office of Defense, and NIH. Platform is an Android cell phone, and so this is just a high-level architecture picture. The main piece of software runs on the cell phone. It accesses internal sensors, the GPS and cell phone accelerometer. For home sensors embedded in the person's home, we have these low-cost Insteon home security type sensors, together with data from the bracelet, are sent through a Wi-Fi relay station running on a laptop to the cell phone. And you might ask, well, why don't all these devices just talk directly to the cell phone? Because we wanted to use a standard off-the-shelf cell phone which speaks different radio protocols than these devices use. Again, if we had maybe future generations of phones or some more expertise on how to reprogram the radios, you could get rid of this extra piece of equipment. And I mentioned, the state estimator uses probabilistic algorithms based on what are called dynamic Bayesian networks to infer the user activity and to learn the user model. So the initial goal, the main goal, of course, is reduced prompting. So prompts are canceled if the user self-initiates or self-terminates a task. So we hope that this will reduce confusion and out-of-sync prompts, and to encourage rather than punish self-initiation. We've been thinking about how can we make the system do even more to encourage self-initiation. That might be one of the therapeutic goals. Well, you could just try prompting later than the scheduled time, give the user more of a chance to self-initiate. However, if the prompt is too late and the user doesn't self-initiate, then the task will fail. So the question comes up, what is the optimal time for the system to prompt? And it turns out not to be totally trivial, because you also have to consider that maybe the person won't respond to the first prompt, and you might have to prompt a second time, okay? And so it becomes a little bit of a small mathematical problem to figure out the optimal prompting time. So the way we've designed the system is that you configure it in several different ways. You can configure it to simply use a fixed prompting schedule. For example, 5 minutes before the scheduled time, or right at the end of the possible time window for that activity. So that would be a case where the caregiver or therapist has a particular schedule that they want to use for prompting. Or you could ask the system to generate an adaptive schedule. How's that done? The caregiver would specify a reward associated with successful task completion and with user self-initiation of a task. So you might say you get 10 points for preparing your lunch, and you get 3 bonus points if you do it without having to be prompted to do it, okay? Now, the relative strength of those two numbers will determine where the optimal prompting point is. So the system then learns a model of the user self-initiation by observing, when does this user self-initiate, and then computes the prompting time that maximizes the expected reward according to these therapeutic parameters. The user model includes a probability distribution over how long it takes the user to self-initiate, if ever. Right? Will the user initiate right away, right at the scheduled time, or late, or perhaps never? When we're looking at this issue of how do you estimate this user model, this probability distribution over self-initiation times, how do you estimate that parameter quickly and accurately? There's a bit of a sort of a hidden technical problem there. Is you say, well, I'm just going to look at what the person did in the past, but in some of those cases, the person was prompted, so you don't really know how long it would have taken the person to self-initiate without the prompt, okay? So how do you then really do the estimation? Well, it turns out that the mathematics for doing that kind of estimation were developed for reliability analysis, where people want to do things like estimate time to failure of a machine part. Here we're estimating time to self-initiation. Even if in the first case, sometimes the part never fails, and in the second case, the person never gets a chance to self-initiate because they were prompted. And so I just have a couple little graphs there that are probably a little bit incomprehensible, but basically what they're showing is these are cumulative distributions for 2 users, one who initiates the task right on time, the other who can take sort of an exponentially long period of time to self-initiate, and how after about, I think we used about, after about 20 examples, the system could very accurately model that kind of behavior. So that would be the red line is the learned line, the green line was the actual line. These are actually with simulated users. Because the system trial, as the video mentioned, starts next month with the Palo Alto VA. We're planning 2 trials, the first with the basic system we've described here, then another one in 6 months, where we hope to enrich the set of sensors. And the goal will be to see how well can we regularize the patient's daily schedule for sleep, meals, exercise, and completing behavioral therapy homework, okay? And I said one of the things we'd like to do in the future, maybe in year 2 of the project, is to get into using some of these physiological sensors, bringing that in, and then perhaps using the physiological data as a way to help trigger when or how often you perform go through your homework book. Again, your homework book would be presented on the iPhone. So that's a quick summary of one project that was essentially completed because the students graduated, although, as I mentioned, there should be some more evaluation done. The second one that's just in progress. And in my remaining 4 or 5 minutes, I'd just like to present some of the challenges in research on assisted cognition systems that came up when we were looking through some recent review articles on see what's been done in terms of evaluating technology for cognition. So one challenge that comes up I think in both of these projects we talked about, and I'm sure with many of the ones you work on, are the tension between point and general solutions. It was stated here by Moffat, Finlater, and Allen, is that a tension exists between satisfying the need for customized solutions that address the immediate needs of users and identifying generalizable results that can be used to achieve long-term research goals. And as I said, what I tried to do in the presentation of the wayfinding work is to sort of illustrate that challenge of trying to find some general principles and then look at how can we adapt within within those general principles. This is, for those of us in this field, it's kind of a scary result from a review paper that just came out by Jude, Hugton, Vehi, and Boxtel. They said they reviewed 28 recent papers on 25 studies of, these were computer-based assistive technology for cognitive disabilities. The total number of participants was 423. Most identified papers described case reports or non-randomized clinical trials. I'm afraid that's us. Only one randomized controlled trial was identified. Now, that suggests two things. One is, when we can do randomized trials, let's do them. But the other is, sometimes that's just not feasible. We really need to work on single subject design, and we need to make that more respectable. The training hurdle is an important one. Again, from that paper, the studies show that the exact amount of time spent on training varied from 30 minutes up to 9 hours. So if you're going to have someone spend 9 hours to get benefit out of a system, they better get a lot of benefit out of it. On the other hand, here's some of the promise, because this is one of the systems that did undergo a nice randomized trial. This is a medication prompting system done by a group of researchers at Oregon State Health and Science University, headed by Misha Pavel, and researchers at Intel Seattle. So a context-aware medication prompting system. It said the conclusion of this paper was, the context-based prompting resulted in a significantly better adherence, 92.3%, as compared to simple time-based prompts, 73.5%, or no prompts, 68.1% conditions. And then it actually has the significance there. In addition, subjects had better adherence in the morning than the evening. We have shown in this study that a system that generates reminders at an opportune time to take the medication significantly improves adherence. So this is certainly good news for all of us, who believe in this vision. Well, at least for medication prompting, it looks like we have some pretty darn solid results. However, I'd like to also mention one of the common pitfalls, and this is about a different home medication prompting system. And it said the participant was building a mental model of how the system behaved, and his model did not map well onto the behavior of the system. The problem was especially pronounced when an activity was not detected properly. So again, this ties in kind of directly to the work we're doing right now with this task prompter. The participant further admitted to changing his behavior in order to fool the system. But since he didn't understand how it worked, this behavior was counterproductive. Okay. So again, this is the real pitfall, is by, we're putting in all this sophisticated technology, we're going to use your activity to make the prompts more optimal, but then system errors can start to get propagated, and the user starts to compensate for the system errors, but they compensate in the wrong direction, and maybe would have been better off with something much simpler. And I think that's exactly my time is up. Thank you.